forest dark and deep, where shadows dance and secrets seep. Iron claws and whispers chase every tranquil hidden place. God, if you're a whisperer there, know I see your twisted stare. Nature's not a gentle breeze, but the grip that never leaves. Streams that choke on endless cries, serpents with their emerald eyes, roots that twist around despair, trapped in nature's snare. God, if you're a whisperer there, know I see your twisted stare. Nature's not a gentle breeze, but the grip that never leaves. Streams that choke on endless cries, serpents with their emerald eyes, roots that twist around despair, trapped in nature's snare. So I wrote these lines in dread, with monsters under silent bed, hoping that the world might see nature's dark duality. God, if you're a whisperer there, know I see your twisted stare. Nature's not a gentle breeze, but the grip that never leaves.
Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I and you get to learn about him through everything he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by a very special co-host rejoining me in this Spirits in Bondage series, Shari. Thank you for joining us today, or joining me today. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, you too. I was wondering if I should talk like Robot Lady, but I thought I wouldn't.
Well,
Wouldn't that be something?
you could give it a shot. I'm sure you'd do a great job.
I
Yeah,
don't know if I could.
we're gonna keep Robot Lady on the sidelines this episode unless we need to reach out to her. I have had a conversation with Sandy in the past on a different C.S. Lewis work, The Weight of Glory, that we'll eventually get to. Right now we're only in the year 1919, 1920, 1921, so it'll be a little bit before I bring that conversation onto the channel. But the book that we're in right now is the first book that C.S. Lewis had published. He had it published under a different name, Clive Hamilton, which is his mother's maiden name, Hamilton. And the last time that you and I were reading through this, we were pretty early on in the book. For me to try to stay consistent with my internal project timeline, I did several episodes with just me and Robot Lady until you and I could get together again. So I appreciate you granting us the leeway to do some episodes without you. Robot Lady does a fine job, but she's no Shari.
Well, I'm sure she's got lots of great historical background information, though, right?
She does. For the most part, yeah, she's really helpful on those fronts. And so I anticipate, if we need to check a word or maybe figure out what reference he's making, we'll bring her in. I have her at the ready, so we'll be good to go on that. Cool. But I gave you a little bit of a briefing before we started that when you and I were reading through it, we just were focused in on some poems in part one, and the book is broken up into 3 parts. Part 1 is entitled The Prison House, I believe. I don't have it in front of me. And then part 2 is called Hesitation. And then part 3 is called Escape. So Robot Lady and I have made our way all the way through, where you and I left off on part 1. We got through part 2, which really isn't saying a lot because part 2 is only 3 poems. And so we've made our way into part 3. But one of the things that I was telling you is part 1 is really just kind of focused on the ambivalence is the wrong word. Sometimes maliciousness that seems to be inherent in nature and also in, what humans do to one another. but also like an inkling towards some defiance of, you know, we looked at one poem that said, hey, the human spirit kind of defies all of this stuff that it sees around it. You know, it's kind of the human spirit vocalized in the narrator of the poem saying to the quote unquote Satan, God of this world, you know, you can try to kill us, but we have a spirit of hope, you know, that is stronger than you, or something like that. That was an interesting little seed of a turn toward maybe some kind of hope or defiance in the first part of the book. You know, not just lamentation about these things and how it's all nonsense and there's no way to get out of it, to maybe some hints that, oh, well, maybe there is something beyond this. There was one poem in part one that Robot Lady and I worked through. And hello, Daniel, by the way. Thanks for joining. I put his comment up on the screen earlier. Daniel's here.
Hi, Daniel.
There was one poem called The Dungeon Grates. And that was the first little inkling of like real hope that there could be something else beyond this. So it was kind of painting the picture, at least in my mind, of a prisoner being in a dungeon, but then seeing light shine through the grates that are coming, you know, from the surface where, you know, water runs down into the dungeon or whatever, but he can see light, he can sense light, and that light's coming from someplace else. So there's more than just this prison. There's more than just this dungeon. Maybe there's freedom beyond all this that we can somehow get to. So he starts dropping little, you know, at least thoughts or suppositions. And, you know, I think he even like contemplates the fact that it could just be false hope. And should I entertain false hope? And that's kind of where he leads into the hesitation part of the book. So some poems of, wow, should I take this plunge? Should I dive in? And I talked a little bit to you off backstage about how there was that one poem where he's like having a conversation with the sea spirits that are saying, yeah, leap in, come on. There's horrible pain here, but there's the lowest lows, but there's also the highest highs. So that's the bargain, you know, for you to come over here and start to seek this. And then we made our way into the escape portion of the book, which is, is your alert system going off?
Okay. Yeah, my alarm's going off, but it's okay.
Okay.
I just had to check and see where they were.
If you need to go out there and save some chickens, don't hesitate.
I might have to go gasping for a minute, but I think it's okay, actually.
Sherry you told me beforehand that you've got a weasel out there that's been killing your chickens.
Yes.
Ugh.
Yes, and he's really being consistent right now. So, and I think I blocked up all the holes, but we'll see.
Your alert system is your dogs. They'll let you know if you need to come around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, that's kind of what we've been working on since you've been gone. And here in the escape part, he really is kind of entertaining the hope and even looking at how can I pursue, you know, chasing after this land. Another really good poem that I enjoyed along the way was, it was something like an ode to pilgrims or something like that. And it's just like talking about the people in this life who are sojourning towards that other land where the sweet smell of these roses is blowing from. So there's just some interesting introspection and some concepts that he's wrestling with that you can see really well in these poems. So that takes us to where we are today. I want us to start on the next poem called Our Daily Bread. It's poem number 32. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Actually, let me see if I can do this in a way that's not too... I mean, I don't want to have to flip back and forth between you and I and the poem itself. So let me try something here. Like I said, this is all an experiment, everything I do on this channel. So let's just keep experimenting. I just got to figure out how to add my screen share here. Is it window capture? I think it is. And then let's see if this is it. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. I know you can't see it on my screen, but I'm sharing it for everybody else. It's kind of covering my face up, but that's not a big deal. I'll get it out of the way after we've read it, or I don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll put it right here. There we go. Close enough. All right. Our daily bread. Do you have it there in front of you, Shari? Are you able to read it? Or do you need me to pull it up on your screen?
I do. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I can read it.
Awesome.
It's interesting that he has it in quotation marks.
Yeah, we'll see what that means.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have a little bit of a lag, but that's okay.
Okay.
Okay. We need no barbarous words nor solemn spell to raise the unknown. It lies before our feet. There have been men who sank down into hell in some suburban street. And some there are that in their daily walks have met archangels fresh from sight of God, or watched how in their beans and cabbage stalks long files of fairy trod. Often, me too, the living voices call, in many a vulgar and habitual place. I catch a sight of lands beyond the wall. I see a strange God's face. And some day this work will work upon me, so I shall arise and leave both friends and home, and over many lands a pilgrim go, through alien woods and foam, seeking the last steep edges of the earth, whence I may leap into that gulf of light, wherein before my narrowing self had birth, part of me lived aright.
Doesn't sound like an atheist to me.
No, and it's really interesting. Like the first thing that flashed in my mind here was his argument with George MacDonald about universalism.
Mm-hmm.
But he seems to have you can see why the concept intrigued him, because, I mean, at least that's what I'm reading into it.
Mm-hmm.
Because he has an inkling, and that's a pun.
Yes.
He has an inkling of the fact that part of him lived right. Part of him was reaching towards the good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I think he's. I mean, from the very little that I know, and I don't I've read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and, Narnia, Space Trilogy. What else have I read? Some other things, but it's a long time ago.
Right?
No, I haven't read that.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought you had.
I haven't read that. I haven't read Till We Have Faces. I haven't. Yeah, I know a lot of people are like, "What? You have to read those." I have a whole stack of books here that but it seems like he was I read The Great Divorce, and that's why I'm thinking of this. Because in The Great Divorce, he's wrestling with this idea of reaching towards the good, and will that be enough, right? Will that be enough to reach towards the good?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's kind of interesting to see that in here. At least I'm seeing it in here a little bit.
I'm trying to make sense of. Well, I guess he's contrasting in these first two stanzas, because he starts off by essentially saying to raise the unknown, or to unveil the things that are unknown in this life, or the things that are beyond. We don't need barbarous words. We don't need a solemn spell. He says it lies before our feet. There have been men, and here's where he starts the contrast, right? Who sank down into hell in some suburban street. And then here's the other side of that coin. And some there are that in their daily walks have met archangels, fresh from sight of God, or watched how in their beans and cabbage stalks long files of fairy trod. So it's like we have some people who I guess have seen the worst of the unknown, and then we have another set of people who have seen the best of it. That's at least what I'm getting out of these two.
Yeah, there's some. Yeah. It's funny because I had a conversation with Jonathan Demir and Nate the other day on Jonathan's channel. And towards the very end of that conversation, I talked about the the conversation I had with myself about the question came up, do you believe in God? And I was very quick to answer with an affirmative, yes, I do. Yes, of course, right?
Yeah.
And then the second question came up, do you believe in fairies? And I'm like, well, if I'm really honest, no. And then the dialogue kind of went, well, if you believe in God, why wouldn't you believe in fairies? And if you believe in fairies, why wouldn't you believe, if you don't believe in fairies, then why don't you not believe in God? Right. So I was having this discussion with myself, and I was trying to be as honest as I could with myself about it. And it's really been on my mind, actually. It's really been on my mind. So it's kind of interesting to read this right now because it's like he's also noticing that people are making a choice about how they want to perceive the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can be in hell on a suburban street, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they were in hell during the war. Maybe it was just down the road from him, when he was a boy, right? Some old grumpy old man kind of thing. Who knows what he's thinking when he writes that line, right? And then others who just choose to, live in an enchanted world, right?
Yeah.
Which brings up the question for me that I was going to ask you before, but I said I'd save it. Where in this timeline do you know? Where was it that he read Phantastes?
I think he was 16, 17 years old. So he's already started reading MacDonald by the time he's writing these poems.
Okay. Because I remember him, he said he picked it up in a train station or something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I have wondered if it was during his service time that and apparently it just kept popping up for him, like wherever he was, he'd see it and he didn't really want to buy it or something like that, but then he did. And because in George MacDonald's fantasy, there's always the choice, right? The choice is always there, and the choice is always yours to make. If you want to live in that enchanted world, or if you don't, right?
Yeah.
And I've made this point also recently because this has really been on my mind. Is so it's kind of serendipitous that we're doing this poem here, but maybe it's just because I'm thinking about this stuff that I'm reading this into it. But there's this thing in George MacDonald's stories where God or an enchanted world is calling a person in, inviting them in, and they don't have to make a firm commitment. They only have to have like an inclination in that direction, and they're already in.
They're whooshed.
Right? They're whooshed in. Yeah. And a good illustration of that is when Mr. Vane falls through the mirror the first time in Lilith.
Yeah.
Because he's not really intending to go through the mirror. He's just trying to get a closer look.
Yep.
But that's how George is demonstrating that curiosity has already taken you, like you're already on your way in other words. Like there's this simultaneous thing that's going on, right? With God and with you. And then you're also making that point earlier that throughout this whole what would you call it? Throughout this whole book of poetry, he's moving and he's being called into this more enchanted way of seeing the world, right?
Yeah, for sure.
At the same time. So that's interesting to me. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, it's like
and sometimes oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, keep going.
Well, another thing that came up for me when you were talking earlier about the hope that he is perceiving even through the darkness. It reminded me also of the book of Job, because that's what happens to Job. So Job, he's in this really bad place of suffering, which is what happened to C.S. Lewis, right? He's in this place of suffering and, men dying, living in trenches, horrible hell on earth. And Job's in a place like that for himself too. But in that suffering, he gets to see little rays of light. Mm-hmm. Job does. Mm-hmm. And so does C.S. Lewis, according to you, because I haven't read all those poems yet, but I believe you. And so it's interesting that it seems to be like in that dark, dark place, seems to be the only place where you can see those little shards of light. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's coming through. Point.
Yeah. I honestly now can't remember if I talked to you about the Dungeon Greats poem before we started the stream or since we've started it. But yeah, it's that okay, same thing.
Just go ahead.
It's like the darkness of the dungeon, but you can see like these streams of lights coming through, and you can see them better because it is so dark around. So that's interesting.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, because when you were talking about that, the way that this is progressing for him, I was thinking of Job saying, because there's this moment in the dialogue with his friends where he goes, but wait, doesn't that, I have seen a stump of a tree grow a new shoot. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Like he just, it comes to, he's remembering something that he's always seen, but never gave it any thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now in this place of darkness, suddenly it holds some kind of substantial information, right?
Yeah.
To him. So, yeah.
No, that's really cool. It's like that, it's like in that moment that it triggers, right? That memory or that remembrance of, wait a second, I have some other knowledge. I have something else that I've witnessed, that I've experienced, that has something more to say.
But you can't grab. Yeah, like it seems like to me, and I'm sure we've all experienced something like that. You just can't grab a hold of it until you're in a certain position, right? And I like to think of it as having perspective. So, maybe you're looking at it face on. Maybe you're looking at it from the side. Maybe now you're looking at it from behind. Mm-hmm. And you're getting all these different dimensions of this thing that you thought you knew, but until you saw it in its full scope, you realize you didn't really know it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you couldn't see
and that's why perspective is so cool, because like as the sun revolves around the earth, we revolve around these things, as we age, right? Or experience life.
Yeah.
We're revolving around this stuff and we're getting different views of it all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's teaching us things.
I think that's right. Yeah. Let's see.
Getting dark.
All right. I just wanted to go into the next part. Often me too, the living voices call, in many a vulgar and habitual place. I catch a sight of lands beyond the wall. I see a strange God's face. So I've asked Robot Lady for the use of the word vulgar here before. I don't think it means, I'm forgetting what it means, but it's not, vulgar.
It's kind of mundane.
Okay.
Mundane.
Got it.
Yeah, I would think about it in that.
Yeah.
Vulgar is just it's the way the people of higher classes would speak about
commonplace.
Just everything.
Things that are commonplace.
Ordinary things. It's actually quite shifted in its meaning through the years.
Okay.
It wasn't a derogatory. It wasn't used as a derogatory, I don't think.
It wasn't a stand-in for profanity. Vulgar speech.
Well, profane and vulgar actually were used in the same way as ordinary, common,
Okay. So they've both taken on that
mundane,
new meaning. Interesting.
and they've taken on that new meaning. Yeah.
So he's saying he's well, actually, there was something in the second stanza where he's talking about there are some that in their daily walks have met archangels fresh from sight of God, or watched in their beans and cabbage stalks long files of fairy trod. This harkens back to something that was in an earlier poem where he had talked about kind of the necessity to get out of the suburban cities and go out into nature, and find either echoes or appearances of these spirits there. And so this kind of harkens back to that, where he's saying, some people who are in the city sink down into hell, when they're in the urban area. But if they can go out, there are some people who go out more into nature, and that's where they find these things. So it just reminded me of an aspect of one of his earlier poems where it kind of, this is a little bit of an echo of that, at least in my mind.
The beans and cabbage stalks. Well, the beans and cabbage stalks would be in someone's garden, eh? Mm-hmm. Like that's where they're seeing the long files of fairy.
Oh, that's true.
Would be in a like a vegetable garden or something. So it would, I think you're right on.
So a portal into nature that's still inside of suburbia, possibly, but also a garden outside the city as well. So he says he does see these spirits sometimes to a strange God's face. That's interesting. And someday this work will work upon me, so I shall arise and leave both friends and home, and over many lands a pilgrim go, through alien woods and foam. In an earlier poem, he was talking about, he had made reference to some Irish folklore, and Jer, aka Logos, had clued me in on how in Irish folklore, the kings and queens of ancient times eventually became fairies. Like they went underground, but also underwater is a part of it, if I'm not butchering this. And Jer, if you happen to be watching right now, I know it's very late for you, but you can correct me where I'm getting this wrong. So where he talks about, going through alien woods and foam, it's like, he's passing through the woods to transition from one place to another, but he's also going through foam. And that reminds me of like going underwater into this other land, the fairyland, that realm.
This also reminds me of Fantastes, because Fantastes starts out with him not really believing in fairies, but he reads, I think he has a little sister, if I remember correctly, and he reads his little sister's story or something about fairies, and he wishes he could go there. And that's another one of those moments where George MacDonald uses that just the slightest inclination towards wanting something, like that desire for God, right? For the enchanted. So he wishes, and it reminds me of the centurion, help me in my unbelief kind of thing, right? So there's this threshold that somehow they've crossed over, but they don't know.
Right.
They don't realize it, right? Yes. And anyway, and so he wakes up in the morning, and his whole room is there's a vine growing up his bed, and then his sink where he would wash up is a creek, and then there's a path that leads into the woods, and and so it sounds very much like this to me. And someday this work will work upon me. So I shall arise and leave both friends and home, and over many lands a pilgrim go, through alien woods and foam, right? Which is exactly what Fantastes does. I mean, Anodos does, right? He goes into this alien woods, and he doesn't leap into a gulf of light or anything, but it's interesting. That's why I had to ask.
You could see the influence. He's definitely read Fantastes or Fantastes. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Fantastes. Yeah.
So yeah, at this point, he's definitely read it, and he's like a real huge lover of the book already, and of the other McDonald things that he can get his hands on.
Okay.
So yeah, you
So
can
it's
definitely
interesting
see
because
it.
he has a sense. He has a sense that he doesn't. He's kind of at its mercy, right? Like it's going to work on him, and he's just waiting for it to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like what you
Right?
said. They've crossed the threshold, but they don't know it yet, and
Yeah.
that's just the
Yeah.
sense that I get out of all of these poems. Is
Right.
he's what's really fascinating, and I talked about this on a previous episode, is in the letters that I've been reading, there's also like footnotes or editor's notes where they'll also bring in little contextual excerpts of letters that his dad and his brother wrote back and forth to each other, or diary
About him?
entries of those two.
Okay.
And there was one where the two of them were talking back and forth about this book, right? As it was being published, they were given access to the manuscript, obviously. And they were both talking about how, yeah, it's clear that he's an atheist. And it's so fascinating because, just like your perspective, like you were talking about, from one point of view, like I could see how they would think that after reading this, but like reading the whole thing and reading it deeply, but maybe it's unfair because we know where he ended up. That I'm just,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, but there's also the voice of the poet and the life of the poet.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true.
And the family tends to look at the life of the poet, right? Like they're like, it doesn't look too Christian to me.
And there's also a lot more conversation contextually to put around this, where it's just like, yeah, I see what the poem says, but you and I have also had some. Well, he was hiding his atheism from his dad as well, and from his brother. The only person who really knew that he would voice some of his, either heretical or outright, I don't believe in the same, faith that you do, was to his friend Arthur Greaves. And so they would have long dialogues back and forth for like a set of letters where they're both like contending back and forth, basically having a debate, an atheist theist debate. Interestingly enough, I've only seen one side of it because I've only been reading the letters that Lewis wrote, but there are probably some letters that exist where the ones that Arthur had written back to Lewis. But all that is to say, where was I going with this? That it's clear to me that he is on the threshold or crossing the threshold already, even though it would probably be closer to the better part of a decade from now to where he finally says, oh yeah, I'm the one being dragged kicking and screaming into, the faith. I'm being grabbed by the collar by God, and I'm a confessing Christian now, and all those kind of things. The most reluctant convert, I think, is how he referred to himself, the most reluctant convert in England. But I don't know. It's just clear to me after reading through these poems that the work is already happening on him, exactly like he says right here. The work is being done on him already.
Yeah, and at this point seems to me to be more of a work of enchantment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the conversation I had with myself. Do you believe in God? Yeah. Right? Because that's kind of, never thought of myself as not believing in God. So now the question comes up, well, do you believe in fairies?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, wait a minute. You're asking me to do that too? Like, isn't it enough that I believe in God? Right? Like, anyway, yeah, there's this favorite scene for me in The Wise Woman by George MacDonald, where the little girl who she takes with her, she's a wise woman, and she goes to the king and queen, and they say, can you do something with our daughter? Because she's just spoiled, rotten, temper tantrum, gets whatever, just. And so she puts her in her cloak because she's fighting. She doesn't want to go with the woman. And she puts her in her cloak and she starts walking, and she keeps her in there for a long time. And she's in the dark. Okay. So she doesn't know what's happening to her. And then the wise woman opens her cloak, decides to let her out because she's been quiet for a while. She's not kicking and screaming and crying, right? And as soon as the girl gets a chance, she runs off. And the wise woman just continues on her journey. And then the little girl gets into this dark forest, loses sight of the wise woman, gets afraid. And as soon as she makes the turn, and like it's not even a full turn, she just has to start, it's like by degrees, okay? The wise woman stands ready for her. And it's again that almost that involuntary, like God just waiting, because it's coming, right? And that's the sense I get, where he says, and someday this work will work upon me, so I shall arise, right? He has a sense from whatever, I don't know if it's from reading George MacDonald or he just has an intuition that this is not something that he has very much control over, which would make me really wonder, and I have wondered, to be honest, if Lewis was actually in opposition to George MacDonald's universalism.
Yeah, he plays with it a little bit in The Great Divorce, in their back and forth conversations, where he even says, wasn't the charge levied against you that you're a universalist? And then I can't remember all of the details of that conversation, but there was a lot of nuance that MacDonald was offering back. So I think Lewis was like playing around with some of the different ideas on the conceptions of hell.
Yeah, like I wonder, Jeff, if he's playing the devil's advocate in that book.
Maybe so.
If anybody's ever thought of it like that, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Because, and someday this work will work upon me, so I shall arise. Okay. Like, what is that? That doesn't sound very voluntary to me.
No, it's kind of like the verse, I can't remember which verse it is, but work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it's the Lord that worketh within you. Lewis at this point knew the Bible back and forth. Like, he's quoting all kinds of things, referencing stuff to make different points in his letters and everything. So he's obviously entrenched in it and grew up with it. So he obviously knows that verse as well. But it's interesting that he would choose to use language that kind of, at least in my mind, harkens a little bit to that as well.
When you said he kept his atheism secret from his family, it could very well be possible that he kept his universalism secret too. And, like, that, I really wondered this, honestly, when it comes to the Great Divorce. So, yeah, just my own ponderings.
Well, maybe once we get there, you and I can try to treat that part of the book.
I would love to do that. Yeah.
Those MacDonald conversations in The Great Divorce are some of my favorite parts of that book.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, yeah, let's finish this off by just reading through this last stanza again. So he says he's going through alien woods and foam, and he's seeking the last steep edges of the earth, whence I may leap into that gulf of light, wherein before my narrowing self had birth, part of me lived aright. So here's what I get from that. Actually, you know what? I talk a lot about what I get from these things. What is that? What do you get from that? You go first.
Well, I think I said that right at the beginning, that I just think it's interesting in light of the opinion that he wasn't a universalist, that he actually realizes that a part of him lived rightly, was righteous, right? And I mean, you shared years ago and I, since that day, have it written down and have shared it and read it and to other people. The portion of the last battle when the prophet of Tash meets Aslan, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's why I just have to wonder if Lewis was actually not a universalist, or if people would just like him to not be a universalist. And he played with them a little bit, it's
Yeah.
possible. Because
Yeah.
he's kind of like that, right? He's kind of secretive. Like he was secretive about his relationship with his friend's mother. He's
Mm-hmm.
secretive about his atheism, and like I've been really thinking about the Great Divorce for a long time, actually, since I met George MacDonald, and thinking, is he just playing? Is he just putting a scenario out there, Lewis? I mean, to make people think more deeply about universalism, and they're just missing it.
Mm-hmm.
They're just thinking, they're just skimming the surface. So they're kind of like, see, it's not true.
Well, Daniel had an interesting question here in the chat. For some reason, I can't even bring it up on
Mm-hmm.
my screen anymore, but I can see it. And he asks, from where do we get that he wasn't a universalist? And I guess my response to that would be just a lot of the things that I read that Lewis wrote whenever he's giving responses or answers to like Christian doctrine and things like that. And he particularly has a chapter in his book, The Problem of Pain, on the topic of hell. And so these kind of things, what's so interesting about Lewis is, people say this a lot, but I'll use it again. I feel like he's a Rorschach test for many people. It's like you're gonna see what you want to see in what he's saying. So if you're more in line with like would call it a traditional interpretation on hell, but maybe that's not fair. I can hear some people running right in and saying, no, the earliest church fathers were universalists. They'll make the case for that, and I'm not here to contend with that either one way or the other.
No.
But the point is,
it doesn't matter.
Yeah. The point is, if you believe if you believe that there is a hell and that people go there and maybe they stay there forever, maybe there's eternal conscious torment, maybe there's not. But if you believe in that idea of hell and that's a place where somebody could end up, you can say, yeah, and Lewis agrees with me here. I'll bring up this proof text and this proof text. He talks about it here. He talks about it in this writing. So to answer your question, Daniel, there are things in his writing that I've read where I've seen it through that lens of, Lewis clearly believes in hell, but he plays with it a little bit in The Great Divorce, which we'll get to. But there's a line in there in The Great Divorce where he's talking about how the gray town is kind of in a twilight, but he says eventually there will be darkness here. And like somebody's on the bus talking about this, saying, and what kind of things come out after dark. It's almost like he's implying there are monsters or demons that are like going to feed on your soul once the gray town, once the sun sets on the gray town and the sun rises in deep heaven. There's kind of going to be a change or a twist for those who decide to remain in the gray town. He also alludes to this a little bit. And I know we're jumping ahead on works we haven't read through yet, so these are kind of like teasers. In Paralandra, the character Weston goes through like this transformation where he basically submits himself to the evil spirits, and essentially demons feast on his soul. There's even talk about this kind of stuff in the Screwtape Letters. But he turns himself so much over to the evil principalities, so to speak, the ones that are driving him, Weston, the villain in the first two books of the Cosmic Trilogy. He turns himself over so much that, like, he even has these phases where he's like, where his conscious self will like rise back up in control of his body, and he'll say to the main character Ransom, he'll be like, help me, they're doing terrible things to me in here. And at that point, you can't really even tell is that the demon talking, or is that Weston talking, or are they now that they've merged into the same person? And so, call that traditional hell or not, that's a hellish existence to like be in that kind of in that kind of state, the picture that he's painting there of what a human soul actually goes through and what that human soul transforms into. So those are just some examples that I would give where you would say, well, even so, could universalism still help eventually pull that person out of that rut, the universalist view? And I would say, from what I understand of the universalist view, well, yeah, even a soul that's has been or is being consumed by evil spirits, and almost completely lost any form of humanity or any form that resembles the image of God. I heard Luke say this the other day. Yeah, but the image of God can't be destroyed. So that's why we're saying that there is universalism. So it's interesting. These are just some of the points that I would draw from some of the things that Lewis wrote about over the course of his writing career.
What comes up for me when you're talking about the idea of the Rorschach test, the scriptures are like that too, right? To be honest. I mean, people will support different doctrines that, like, real opposing doctrines from the scriptures, and so there is this, and like George MacDonald talks about this too. He talks about George MacDonald basically says that there's, we have the intellect and we have the imagination, and the imagination is the architect and the intellect is the workman. And so we have to allow, and this is a very McGilchrist thing to say, right? Like, this is really the master and the emissary. And so we have to infuse what we're looking at with the imagination. I was talking to Eugene Terrakin the other day, and he put it this way: you have to pierce the mirror, right? This is what MacDonald does. He pierces the mirror. And so you can look at the thing and you can see what you're looking at, or you can pierce through it and enter into a completely different realm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how the scriptures are. They're iconic, right? They're fractal. There are very many different layers of interpretation for scripture. I know some people would disagree with that, but there are at least 4. And they are spiritual texts, like, yeah. So, and because of the wealth of experience that Lewis has with mythology, especially with mythology of all kinds, he would understand that deep fractal layer and the ability to work a story that is both literal and allegorical, and so people could be and will be reading it as a Rorschach test. Like, it'll serve the purpose. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this gets exactly to George MacDonald's idea of meaning. Like, in his Fantastic Imagination essay, he says, someone asks him, an imaginary person says, well, how do I know I'm getting the meaning that you wrote in your fairy tale? How do I know I'm getting that meaning? And he says, what's the phrase he uses? Why should you be so assured? First of all, he asks them that. Why do you need to be so assured about that? Like, and then he says, perhaps your meaning is superior to mine. And the reason he can say that is because of this idea of this perspective and the place that you are in your life. And you're going to take from the story what you need, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, like, he says about children, he says, don't worry about your children to this person, because they're like, I want to explain this to my children, so I need to know what you meant, right? He goes, don't worry about your children. They'll take what they can. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a it's a bit of a little bit of a shove down of the person who thinks that they should know everything.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, you need to be like a little child, right? Take what you can from the story. Don't worry about the meaning. Maybe your meaning is superior to mine. and so I think, because Lewis was so engaged with MacDonald's work. And to be honest with you, Jeff, like after having gone through the 2 imagination essays by George MacDonald, I can see each one of the Inklings, except for Charles Williams, who I don't know much about. But Barfield, Tolkien, and Lewis, I can see them kind of moving out from that center. From what he says in that essay, moving out and pursuing the things that really grasped them, like really grabbed them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what I always found very beautiful was that the only person to actually credit George MacDonald was C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To say, I know that nobody's noticed, so I'm going to have to say it out loud.
Right.
But there's nothing that I haven't written that he hasn't influenced, or that I haven't quoted him, or that I haven't used his ideas, or that I haven't. Nothing.
Yes.
Is what he said.
Yeah.
Right.
And you're quoting from, or at least you're paraphrasing from the intro, or maybe it was the preface that he wrote to his anthology on George MacDonald.
Yes.
Where he pieces together just several different quotes of things that he loved out of MacDonald's writings.
He takes the whole book is from they're quotes from George MacDonald's unspoken sermons.
Yes.
That really spoke to Lewis.
Yeah.
And it's not a thin book. It's a pretty decent book.
And it's my plan as well on this project, because I consider that a book that C.S. Lewis wrote. Really, he edited it, like he compiled different quotes. But I plan to go through that as well. And then maybe as a bonus project after all this is done, I'll do a deep dive into MacDonald as well. So I'm sure I'll be calling on you to help me with those.
Yeah, I'd love to do that with you. You know what I really love about that anthology is that it's standalone. There's no commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Like Lewis is he's really abiding by this idea that George MacDonald has about meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's not giving it any meaning.
Yeah.
He's just letting it speak for itself and letting it work, just like in this poem. And someday this work will work upon me, so I shall arise and leave, right? Like, think about it. Like, I'm getting goosebumps, actually.
Well, I think that's a really good place to end. I was going to try to add something to it with what I saw in this last stanza here, but I won't ruin it. I'll
let's hear it. No, let's hear it.
Okay, just really quick. So there's another allusion to another poem that he had mentioned earlier, where he had talked about like these giant columns that the pilgrims reach when they're searching for this far off land. And Jer had added some context for me to say, it's in like the columns of Hercules represent like the edge of the human world. So he had brought that into it. And then we're talking about the last steep edges right here of the earth, where he can leap into that gulf of light, wherein before my narrowing self had birth. And there's another picture that I'm thinking of here in the Chronicles of Narnia, which we'll get to. It's in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where there's this edge of the ocean, or this edge of the world, where you leave the realm that you know when you're going off into this other realm. And Tolkien even draws that picture at the end of at the end of all of the Lord of the Rings, where Frodo and Bilbo, at least in the movie, I haven't read Return of the King. I've read the first 2 books, but where they go off into, I forget what the name of the lands are. People who know Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings better will know what I'm talking about. But just this last part where he says, wherein, like this gulf of light, kind of the other realm, right, beyond this earthly realm. It says, what I'm reading in this last line is before I was born,
Mm-hmm.
before the narrowing self that I am right now, the just the tiny piece of what I know of myself, before that was given birth, part of me lived aright here already. So if we collapse what time is, he's essentially saying I either already am living there in the future, and perhaps I lived there in the past before I was conscious of this earthly realm, this self that I know that was living here. There was a part of me that either had been living aright this whole time or will be living aright, for all time.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I didn't notice that actually. Wherein before my narrowing self had birth. I don't know why that didn't jump out at me, but yeah, that's like a pre existence, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's interesting. Part of me lived to right. Origin would love that.
There's a nice little comment from Daniel here in the chat that says maybe off riffing or off of what you were talking about with McDonald and the imagination, and somebody asking well, can you give me the true interpretation? Daniel says, maybe don't worry if your interpretation is correct, and worry instead if it points you at the good. Maybe that's a way to look at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
whatever it is, it's going to speak to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of the Rorschach test is kind of interesting because it seems dismissive of the subjective experience. I don't know, because I'm not a philosopher, if this is a postmodern take where it turns the subjective experience of a person into a truth. So then truth becomes not apprehendable. Like, it's the big question Pilate asked, right? What is truth?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting twist of events, actually, that we are given the instruction, like you said earlier, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, which is a responsibility, to us as a person. And that our relationship to God is personal. Our knowledge of God is personal. So we each have a God of our own understanding, right? But that does not make the truth of the reality, capital R, let's say, patterns, as Jonathan Pajot would say, that doesn't change that reality. It's still the same pattern, right? And so I think that's also something to think about when he says that, and someday this work will work upon me, because this work is something that is it must be some kind of underlying pattern or reality that is true for everyone, no matter their own subjective experience or their own conception of, or whatever the case might be, right?
Well, it's like there's so much more there than we can apprehend. Like you talked about the shoots coming out of the stump. Like I just see shoots coming out of a stump. It scans on one level, but I don't register it as having like meaning or relevance to what it is that I'm doing when I happen to observe it in that moment. But now, when I am in that different perspective, or something in me has changed, or something in me has been built up, or I've had a series of experiences, and now that has a different significance. So significance is a good word, sign, signifier, those kind of things.
Right. Right.
Which is, these things have more than one meaning. Obviously, everything in reality, everything that we encounter has more than one meaning. It's just we can't see the whole of it at all times, right? We have to progress through certain levels of development, maybe, or layers of experience, or personal interactions, like getting pieces of other persons, like interacting with you interacting with me. I hear something that you say that will file itself away in my mind, but then when I'm in a different discussion or I'm in a different situation, that will somehow tie to something that I see right there, and it will make more sense of what that thing signifies than it would have had we not had this conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful.
All right. Well, I would have liked to have gone through more poems with you. However, I like better the fact that we just get a chance to talk more and more than just sit here and read things. So that's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really good. Yeah.
My next poem is 33, but I'm out of time for today. So if we get the chance and I haven't read through and finished this book, I'd love to do this book with you again. Or like we mentioned before, we can find some other Lewis stuff to work through if you're up for it, Shari. I love talking to you.
I'm totally up. Yeah. Yeah. And I do have, I'm more flexible time-wise now, Jeff.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just the last couple of weeks was a little bit overwhelming, but yeah, anytime after 11 o'clock in the morning, because I do chores in the morning.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we can coordinate, and my schedule's getting
good.
Packed over the next couple of weeks. So for me, my time frees up in the new year. So we might find ourselves in a situation where you're not free again and I'm free, but we'll figure it out. We'll figure out that.
No, I'll be good. I'll be good. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Shari.
Sounds great.
I appreciate it every time that you come on. I'm going to go ahead and shut things down here and tell everybody who's been watching, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Daniel left a comment that this was an amazing episode. Thank you both, he says to us. Thank you, Daniel. And to Daniel,
Daniel, and
everyone else, to you as well, Shari. Until my next read on C.S. Lewis, take care.
Bye. See you, Jeff.
Reading through the pages, C.S. Lewis wisdom bold. Every line a treasure, stories timeless, cold. On YouTube, shimmering thoughts, chronicles unfold. From the start till the end, magic tales retold. Lewis in time, reading every word. Journey online, voices must be heard. Order of his crafting, all his works in line. Thoughts are everlasting, echo through the time. Mystery and magic, wise beyond his age. Commentary logic on this digital stage. Lewis in time, reading every word. Journey online, voices must be heard. Crafting all his works in line. Thoughts are everlasting, echo through the time. Mystery and magic, wise beyond